When I saw my reflection in the mirror that morning, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her shoulders were drawn in slightly, not from cold, but from habit, the habit of taking up less space. Her eyes held no sparkle, only the dull sheen of someone who had spent years being spoken over, passed by, and slowly turned into furniture. I adjusted the collar of my blouse, dabbed perfume on my wrists, and paused. He wouldn't notice. He never did. The man I married stopped looking at me a long time ago, not with anger, not even with indifference, but with absence. I could vanish and he'd probably just wonder where the salt went. But that day, something changed. That day, someone else saw me. Not as a wife, not as a homemaker, not as background noise in the echo chamber of our home. He saw me as a woman. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even invited. And yet, it happened. So before you judge me, before you decide what kind of person I must be, let me take you back. Back to the moment everything began, a quiet afternoon, an open window, and a request I hadn't expected. But first, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Because that's where my story starts. I don't know what possessed me to agree to his request. Perhaps it was the way he asked, not with the entitlement of a man, but the wonder of an artist. It had been years since anyone looked at me that way. Years since I was asked for anything other than errands, laundry, or quiet compliance. But that afternoon, on the veranda, as the wind played with the hem of my linen skirt, he looked up from his sketchbook and said, "Can I draw you?" At first, I thought he was joking. I laughed, that awkward, throat-tight laugh women do when caught off guard. He didn't laugh back. He just waited. Something in his expression disarmed me. Not desire. Curiosity. Respect. And something else, recognition. I said yes. It felt small at the time, a harmless gesture. I would sit for a while, let him sketch, then return to my day of chores in silence. But the moment I stepped into the dusty studio on the second floor, something shifted. The room was warm and smelled faintly of linseed oil and citrus. Canvases leaned against the walls, and the windows were cracked open just enough to let in the late afternoon sun. He pulled out a wooden stool for me, dusted it with his sleeve, and gestured with a slight nod. I sat, folding my hands in my lap, unsure of where to look. He didn't tell me to smile. He didn't position me. He just said, "Be still." So I sat. And for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not for what I did, not for who I had been, but for what I was, here and now. My back straightened instinctively. I uncrossed my ankles. I let myself breathe. He drew in silence, save for the scratch of graphite against paper. Every so often, he would glance up, his gaze steady but not invasive. I studied the studio's details to distract myself, the fraying edges of the rug beneath my feet, the small crack in the windowsill, the rusted tin can holding his brushes. When it was over, he closed the sketchbook gently, like tucking in a child. "Thank you," he said. "You have a very still kind of energy." I nodded, unsure of what that meant. Back in the kitchen, my husband was on his laptop, hunched over spreadsheets. I passed by him, my perfume lingering for a moment. He didn't look up. "Dinner will be late," I said. "Machem," he mumbled, fingers still dancing on keys. Upstairs, I could still feel the weight of that gaze, not heavy, but grounding. Like stepping into your own name after years of being called something else. That night, as I brushed my hair before bed, I glanced at my phone. No messages. No missed calls. No invitations. I ran a hand down my arm, over the skin that hadn't been touched in weeks, maybe months. The only hand that grazed my body these days was my own. In bed, my husband turned away as always, exhaling with the finality of someone already asleep. But I couldn't sleep. My thoughts wandered back to the studio. To the dust particles dancing in the light. To his eyes, scanning but not devouring. To the way he had noticed the curve of my shoulder, the angle of my jaw. And I wondered, had I really said yes just for him? Or had I been waiting for someone to ask all along? The next morning, he left early, a business breakfast, he said, though he hadn't told me the night before. I lingered longer than usual in my robe. Made coffee slowly. Moved without purpose, savoring the silence. Then I heard it, a knock on the studio door. Soft. Tentative. I opened it. He stood there, holding a folded page. I made some adjustments, he said. Thought you might like to see it. He handed me the sketch, now refined. More detailed. My face, drawn with an honesty that startled me. I didn't realize, I whispered. What? That I still looked like me. He smiled, barely. It's all still there. Just needed to be noticed. I don't remember inviting him in, but soon we were both in the kitchen. I made tea, the kind with lemon balm and honey. We spoke of art. Of shapes. Of how difficult it was to capture stillness in movement. It was a strange kind of intimacy, not physical, not even flirtatious. But dense. Heavy with what was unsaid. That evening, I wore perfume again. Not for my husband. And once more, I found myself staring at the woman in the mirror. Her eyes held something new. Not joy. Not guilt. Possibility. A door had opened. A small one. But I had stepped through. The next few days passed with a peculiar quietness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. My husband came and went as he always did, punctual, distracted, dependable. He kissed my cheek in the morning, asked about errands in the evening, and never once noticed the subtle change in my posture, the way I stood longer before the mirror or chose a blouse with softer fabric. If he sensed anything, he didn't say. Maybe that was the rhythm we had fallen into, silent assumptions and overlooked signals. I, however, felt everything. There was a moment, just before dinner on Thursday, when I caught my reflection in the oven door. I stood still, holding a wooden spoon, steam rising around me, hair pinned up messily, and yet, there was a spark in my eyes. Not fire, not even defiance. But awareness. I had become aware of my own presence again. That was the danger. Not the act of sitting for him, but the act of becoming visible, to someone, to myself. He didn't come by the studio for a couple of days. Perhaps he sensed my hesitation. Or maybe he was giving me space. But Saturday afternoon, while I was folding laundry, I heard a soft knock on the studio door again. I hadn't expected it, but something in me had hoped for it. I found him there, sleeves rolled, brushes scattered across the table, and the scent of paint already in the air. He didn't greet me with words. Instead, he nodded toward the stool, already positioned where the late sun poured in through the window. Without speaking, I stepped into the space. We both knew what was about to happen. This time, I didn't feel nervous. There was no uncertainty in my limbs. I knew where to sit, how to hold myself. Not stiff or formal, but honest. My posture wasn't rehearsed, it was felt. He observed in the quiet way only artists know, seeing without intruding. I focused on the far window, watching the curtain lift and fall in rhythm with the breeze. His pencil moved confidently. Faster than before. As if he had been thinking of this exact moment and was now simply recording what he had already seen in his mind. I wasn't just a subject anymore, I was the narrative. At one point, I adjusted my shoulder slightly. A small shift. But he paused, eyes meeting mine. The look wasn't long, but it said enough. That he noticed. That he registered every subtle change, not with judgment, but with reverence. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me like I mattered in that way. When the session ended, he closed the sketchbook with a quiet firmness and said thank you, as he always did. But then, instead of walking away, he remained still. I stayed too. Neither of us made a move to leave. I think this is my best work, he said softly. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't agree, but because my voice didn't trust itself. Words in that room suddenly felt too loud, too risky. We moved to the kitchen. I poured 2 glasses of water, pretending to be composed, and he leaned against the counter, arms folded. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was full. Heavy with everything neither of us dared to name. Then it happened. We kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was soft, brief, uncertain in its initiation but sure in its meaning. It didn't last long, but its echo lingered in the air long after we stepped apart. He stepped back first. I turned toward the sink, gripping the edge as though the cold steel might anchor me to the present moment. I felt warmth creeping up my chest and into my neck, not shame, not regret. Just heat. The sensation of blood remembering how to move with purpose. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. When he left, I didn't follow him. I stayed in the kitchen, tracing circles with my fingertip on the countertop, the kiss still humming quietly on my lips. It wasn't betrayal yet. Not exactly. But it had crossed a line I could no longer pretend didn't exist. That evening, my husband returned late. A business meeting that ran over, he said. I smiled and nodded, asking about his day, making small comments about dinner. He answered automatically, his mind still elsewhere. He didn't notice the faint shift in my tone or the delay in my gaze. He didn't ask why I hadn't worn my usual sweater, or why my sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Later, I lay beside him in bed, both of us facing opposite walls, the silence between our backs louder than any confession. I listened to the rhythm of his breathing, the rustle of the sheets when he shifted, the occasional cough in his sleep. My body felt present, raw in a way it hadn't for years. As if it had been reminded it was made of skin and nerve endings, not just muscle and function. I closed my eyes, but the image of the sketch returned again and again, the way he had captured me, not just the curve of my jaw or the angle of my neck, but the very sensation of being looked at. The space I occupied. The story I told without speaking. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I found a folded note tucked beneath the edge of the coffee cup he always used in the studio. It wasn't elaborate, just one sentence in pencil. You gave me something I didn't know I needed. I read it 3 times before slipping it into the pocket of my robe. That day, I canceled my plans with the neighbor. Said I had a headache. Instead, I sat in the studio after lunch, alone. I flipped through his sketchbook, carefully, page by page. Each drawing told its own truth, but one in particular held my breath hostage. It was me, yes, but different. Braver. Warmer. As if I had been drawn not from the outside in, but from the inside out. I don't know how long I sat there. Time folded around me. I only moved when I heard my husband's car in the driveway. I put the book back exactly where I had found it and went downstairs. Dinner was quiet again. He talked about a new client. I nodded, asked the right questions. Laughed when he laughed. But inside me, something had cracked open. Something that could not be closed again. I didn't know where this road would lead. I didn't even know if I wanted it to lead anywhere. But I did know one thing. The next time he asked me to sit for him, I wouldn't hesitate. Because in that chair, under that light, I felt more alive than I had in years. The following morning greeted me with a sky painted in washed-out gray. The air was still, almost heavy, as though the world had paused briefly to give me time to think. But I wasn't sure I wanted that. Thinking had become dangerous. Every thought now branched out in too many directions, tangled in questions with no clear answers. I moved through my usual routine like a performer who'd grown too used to the stage. I made coffee, wiped the counters, opened the windows. My hands worked from memory, while my mind stayed stuck in that fleeting moment from the day before, the way his lips met mine, the way silence had followed us like a witness. I kept replaying it, not to relive it, but to understand it. What had changed? What had already been changing, quietly, beneath the surface? At breakfast, my husband was there. Not truly present, of course, but seated across from me, sipping coffee and reading the financial news on his tablet. He didn't glance up once. I studied him for a long time, not with judgment, not even with bitterness. Just observation. His movements were practiced, exact, even comforting in their consistency. He stirred his coffee 3 times. He chewed his toast in even bites. He never asked me how I slept. Maybe I wouldn't have told him the truth even if he had. After he left for work, I found myself pacing the living room. I wasn't waiting for anything in particular, but I couldn't sit still. I tried folding laundry, then abandoned it halfway through. I rearranged the bookshelf, wiped the kitchen sink, refilled the bird feeder outside. Nothing helped. The stillness was louder than noise. I finally wandered upstairs and stopped outside the studio door. It was closed, as always when he wasn't in it. The handle felt cool under my hand. I didn't open it. I just stood there for a moment, listening, as if the silence inside might speak first. Later that day, I went to the market. I needed groceries, or at least that was the excuse I gave myself. In truth, I needed space, movement, crowds, something to blur the edges of the thoughts crowding my mind. The streets were full of ordinary noise, car horns, snippets of conversation, the rustle of plastic bags. Life, uninterrupted. I found myself lingering longer in the produce section than necessary. I caught glimpses of couples, older ones holding hands, younger ones arguing in hushed tones. It reminded me that intimacy comes in many forms, not always pleasant, but always human. I wondered which version of intimacy I'd been living with for years, or if I'd been living with any at all. On my way out, I passed by a small art shop tucked between a bakery and a tailor. I'd walked by it dozens of times but never gone in. This time, I stopped. The window displayed a collection of sketchbooks, framed charcoal portraits, and brushes with worn handles. Something about the smell of paper and pigment wrapped around me the moment I stepped inside. The shopkeeper, an older woman with silver hair and thick glasses, gave me a polite nod but didn't hover. I browsed without intention, letting my fingers drift across covers and spines, textures and grains. Eventually, I picked out a small blank notebook and a thin pencil. I didn't know what I'd do with them. But I didn't want to leave empty-handed. Back home, I placed the notebook on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Then I opened it and wrote only one word on the first page: stillness. That evening, I cooked dinner as usual. He returned from work at his regular time. We ate in silence, save for the clink of silverware and the occasional mention of a meeting or an email. When he excused himself to the den, I sat at the table alone, finishing my wine. It was during this quiet moment that I realized something simple and unsettling. I wasn't waiting for anything from him anymore. Not even anger. Not even attention. The need for those things had slowly faded, replaced by something harder to define. Not freedom. Not exactly. But detachment. As though a string connecting us had quietly unraveled, fiber by fiber. The next day, he didn't knock. I found the studio door slightly ajar in the afternoon, and that in itself felt like an invitation. When I stepped inside, the room was bathed in gold light from the setting sun. The stool had been moved to the center. A fresh canvas rested on the easel. Brushes lay neatly beside the palette, which already bore signs of preparation. I didn't hear him enter. He was just suddenly there, standing by the window, looking out as though he hadn't heard me come in. "You don't have to pose," he said quietly, without turning. "I just wanted you to see the light." I stood beside him, following his gaze. The light was beautiful, warm, angled, soft around the edges. It made even the dust motes look like stars. We didn't speak for several minutes. There was no awkwardness, no tension. Just two people watching the world change color. Eventually, he walked to the easel, dipped a brush in ochre, and made a single stroke across the canvas. "It's not about the likeness anymore," he murmured. "It's about what I see when I look at you." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. That sentence carried a weight that language could not fully hold. It pressed against something inside me I hadn't dared name. I left the studio not long after. No drawing session that day. No kiss. Just a quiet understanding, a layer added to a story that was still being written, whether I wanted it to be or not. That night, I didn't sleep easily. My thoughts swirled, not in panic, but in reflection. I thought of how quickly a moment can shift your entire sense of self. How a gesture, a glance, a stroke of pencil on paper can expose more than words ever could. I thought about how I used to avoid mirrors. And how now, I found myself searching for them. Not for vanity. But for proof. Proof that I still existed. That I was still more than memory and routine. That I could still be seen. The days began to fold into each other with a softness that felt both comforting and deceptive. My routines remained unchanged on the surface as breakfast, errands, dinners that filled the plate but never the silence. But underneath, a quiet shift had taken root, subtle but undeniable. The air between us, me and him, had grown dense with unspoken meaning, the kind that sits heavily in the chest but doesn't ask for language. I didn't avoid the studio anymore. Nor did I go looking for it. It was simply there, like a room I now carried inside myself. A space that had become symbolic, not just of art, but of awakening. Some days I would pass by and see the door slightly open, light pouring across the hall like an invitation. Other days it remained closed, as though needing rest. The changes in me didn't scream. They whispered. I noticed myself walking differently, more upright, more deliberate. I began choosing clothes with fabric that felt good against my skin rather than simply practical. I started wearing earrings again, not for anyone else's benefit, but because I liked the way they made me feel present. It was strange how small decisions could ripple so wide. One afternoon, after returning from a walk, I found a note slid under my bedroom door. It was folded neatly, a single line written in his careful, almost architectural handwriting. "Would you come sit tomorrow morning?" It didn't ask, it didn't beg, it simply existed. I held it in my hand for a long while before nodding to myself, even though no one could see me. That evening, my husband commented on the stew I had made. Said it was especially good. I thanked him, quietly amused by the surprise in his voice, as though it had never occurred to him that I might still be capable of effort. He didn't ask what I'd done that day, or why I looked more rested. He just ate and checked his email while chewing. At some point, he looked up and asked if we were low on printer paper. I said I'd buy some. In bed that night, I lay awake long after he'd turned off the light. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional creak of the house settling. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even excited. What I felt was something steadier, a readiness, perhaps. Not for anything specific, but for the experience of being fully present. That had been missing from my life for so long. I hadn't noticed its absence until I began tasting it again in fragments. The next morning, the studio was warm with sunlight. The windows were open, and the light poured in at an angle that painted soft rectangles across the hardwood floor. He had already prepared the space. A fresh canvas stood tall on the easel, and there was a thermos of tea placed near the stool, chamomile, I assumed, from the scent. No words were exchanged as I entered. He looked up from mixing paint, gave a small nod, and gestured toward the chair. I took my place. This session was different. He didn't draw immediately. For a few minutes, he simply observed. I returned his gaze with something quiet but steady, an openness I hadn't known I possessed. There was no fear, no fidgeting, no need to perform. I simply existed in that space, as I was. Whole. Unpolished. Awake. Eventually, he began to paint. The rhythm of his brushstrokes was calming. Not rushed or urgent, but patient, thoughtful. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the sound become background music. I wasn't posing in the traditional sense. My posture wasn't dramatic, nor did I hold a practiced expression. I just let myself be there, with the fullness of everything I had become. A part of me wondered what he was seeing. Whether he focused on the lines near my eyes, the softness in my arms, the way my collarbone curved just beneath the neckline of my blouse. But another part didn't care. This wasn't about flattery. This wasn't about being idealized. It was about truth. Presence. Light on skin. Emotion beneath silence. At one point, I shifted slightly. He didn't say anything, but I noticed his hand pause midair before resuming with a new intention. The moment was so small, yet it carried weight. In that pause, I felt our understanding deepen. We didn't speak for the entire hour. And still, so much had been said. When the session ended, he stepped back and looked at the canvas. I didn't ask to see it. I didn't need to. The real portrait wasn't on the canvas, it was in the way I stood up without rushing, in the way I thanked him with my eyes rather than my mouth. As I reached for my scarf, I noticed a familiar object on the shelf near the door, a photograph in a wooden frame. It was a younger version of him, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. Her hand was resting lightly on his shoulder. They were smiling, but their eyes told different stories. I didn't ask who she was. It wasn't my place. But I understood, somehow, that this wasn't his first time trying to paint his way out of silence. That evening, I walked to the bookstore. I hadn't done that in years. I browsed for almost an hour, running my fingers along the spines, flipping through pages. I picked up a collection of essays on aging, another on the psychology of creativity. I bought both. On my way home, I passed a florist and, without thinking, bought a small bouquet of freesia. Not for anyone. Just for the table. Just because I could. When I got home, the house was quiet. My husband was still out, probably working late. I made myself a cup of tea, arranged the flowers, and sat at the kitchen table with the books unopened beside me. For a long time, I just watched the steam rise from the mug. The light above the table flickered faintly, and I made a mental note to replace the bulb. Later, when he returned, he remarked on the flowers. "Company coming?" he asked. "No," I said simply. "I just liked them." He nodded, more confused than curious, and went upstairs without another word. I remained in the kitchen for a while, sipping tea, listening to the distant sound of water running. My hand brushed over the spine of one of the books, but I didn't open it. Instead, I looked at the flowers. Bright. fragile, fully themselves. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I was, too. The following days felt heavier, as though each moment carried a weight I couldn't put into words. I moved through my usual routines, but there was a shift in how I inhabited them. The kitchen wasn't just a place for meals anymore, it was where my thoughts tangled and unraveled. The living room, once just furniture and muted television screens, now felt like a waiting area between what my life had been and whatever it was becoming. And the studio, always the studio, had become a place where I breathed differently, where every quiet moment left a trace under my skin. The fifth morning after our last session, I found myself standing by the window, holding my coffee cup but not drinking. Outside, the early light washed the street in pale gold, making everything look both fragile and endless. I thought about how many mornings I'd stood there without seeing anything, my gaze unfocused, my mind occupied by lists and errands. But lately, I'd been seeing more. The shape of shadows, the softness in colors, the way silence could feel alive. I didn't plan to go to the studio that day. I told myself I had too much to do, groceries, phone calls, maybe even cleaning out the closet. But as soon as I heard footsteps on the stairs, I knew I would go. It wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about what I felt when I stepped inside that room, present, deliberate, unblurred. When I entered, the smell of paint greeted me like something familiar. He had been working already. I saw unfinished strokes on a canvas leaning against the wall. He looked up, meeting my eyes with an expression that wasn't a smile but carried the softness of one. He gestured toward the stool, but this time there was no rush. I walked to it slowly, taking in the space, noticing how the light fell across the floorboards like a path. We didn't speak for the first few minutes. He adjusted his palette, selecting colors with care. I sat still, hands resting loosely in my lap, my breath steady. The quiet between us wasn't heavy or awkward. It felt like part of the process, like the silence was painting something too. This time, I wasn't thinking about how I looked. I wasn't worrying about my posture or the lines on my face. I just let myself be. I thought about how rare it was to simply exist without the pressure of expectation. No roles, no tasks. Just presence. That kind of stillness was its own kind of beauty, I realized, one I had forgotten. As the session went on, I felt his attention sharpen. Not in a way that crossed boundaries, but in a way that made me aware of the details I usually ignored. The texture of my sleeve, the way my hair caught the light, the way my breath shifted my shoulders ever so slightly. I wondered if this was what it meant to really see someone, not to look for flaws or perfection, but simply to notice. At some point, he paused, set down his brush, and looked at me directly. There was no warning, no build-up. Just that quiet moment between breaths. We kissed. It was brief and soft, as if neither of us wanted to disturb the silence. It felt less like a decision and more like a natural extension of the moment, something that couldn't not happen. When it ended, we both stayed still, letting the quiet settle around us again. I stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of my blouse, trying to ground myself. My heart wasn't racing, but it was awake in a way that startled me. I could feel each beat, not with fear or guilt, but with a kind of clarity. The kiss wasn't something I could undo. It wasn't something I wanted to undo. But I also knew it wasn't something I could name or explain, not even to myself. We didn't talk about it. Instead, he picked up his brush and continued painting, as if the moment had simply become another layer of color on the canvas. I sat back down, watching his hand move, feeling the room shift around us. There was no going back to how things had been before, but I didn't want to go back. Later that afternoon, I walked through town, trying to clear my mind. I bought a loaf of bread from the bakery, watched the pigeons gather near the fountain, and thought about how strange it was that everything outside looked so normal when inside me, something had shifted irrevocably. The world didn't care about my awakening, my confusion, my choices. It just carried on, indifferent but alive. When I returned home, the house was quiet. My husband was still at work. I placed the bread on the counter and stood for a while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. It struck me how much of life happens in the spaces between conversations, between decisions, between what we say and what we mean. That evening, he came home tired. He asked about dinner, about errands, about the car insurance renewal. I answered mechanically, my voice even. He didn't notice anything different. Or maybe he did, but chose not to look too closely. We were both skilled at maintaining a surface that required no questions. After dinner, while he watched the news, I went upstairs and opened the small notebook I had bought at the art store. On the second page, under the word stillness, I wrote, "A kiss can change the air even when nothing else changes." I stared at the sentence for a long time, then closed the notebook without adding more. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside me. I didn't feel guilty, not in the way I expected. What I felt was complicated, layered, like I had been handed a mirror that showed me parts of myself I'd ignored. It wasn't about betrayal or desire. It was about being alive, fully, in a way that startled me. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought of the canvas in the studio, of the colors blending and shifting under his hand. I wondered how he would capture today, if he could. And I wondered if, in some quiet corner of that painting, he would hide the moment when we kissed, knowing it would never need words. There's something about silence that changes once it's been broken in a meaningful way. Not the comfortable, shared quiet between two people who know each other well, but the fragile kind of silence that follows a moment you're not supposed to speak about. That's what settled between us after the kiss. The studio no longer felt like a room suspended in innocence. It hadn't become something tainted either, it had simply shifted into a space where intention lived alongside restraint. In the days that followed, I felt as though I was walking beside myself. I continued my life as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. My husband and I went through our routines seamlessly. He didn't notice the extra care I took when dressing, or how long I stood by the window with my coffee. If he sensed a difference, he didn't let on. I wasn't sure if that comforted or disappointed me. I didn't see the artist again for 3 days. Not because I was avoiding him. And not, I believed, because he was avoiding me. There was just a natural pause, as if both of us had stepped to the edge of something and needed time to decide what came next. In those days, I busied myself with tasks I had put off for months. I cleaned out the linen closet, reorganized the pantry, even dusted the shelves in the guest room. Each act felt strangely deliberate, like I was trying to reaffirm my role in the house, to remind myself who I was, or at least who I had been. But the stillness inside me persisted. On the 4th morning, I walked past the studio and saw the door ajar. The familiar scent of turpentine and canvas drifted into the hallway like a greeting. I paused, unsure. Part of me wanted to step in without hesitation, to resume whatever it was we had started. But another part of me hesitated, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what the space had become. I knocked gently before pushing the door open. He was seated at the easel, brush in hand, eyes focused. He didn't look up right away. When he did, it was with that same steady calm he always carried, but there was something different in it now. Recognition, maybe. Or acceptance. There was no formal invitation this time. No request. He simply gestured toward the stool, and I understood. I sat, adjusting my skirt quietly, folding my hands in my lap. The room was filled with golden morning light, the kind that softened everything it touched. It felt familiar and new all at once. This time, he didn't pick up his brush immediately. He watched me for a while, his gaze quiet but intense. I met it without flinching. There was no reason to pretend anymore. Whatever line had once existed between us had blurred beyond recognition. Eventually, he began to paint. I stayed still, my body relaxed, but my thoughts were anything but. I wondered what he saw now, what parts of me were becoming visible through the layers of paint. I wondered what part of him was being left behind in every stroke. There was a strange intimacy in knowing that we were both recording each other in different ways, of me, through memory, and him, through image. Time passed differently in that room. Minutes stretched, then disappeared. The longer I sat, the more I felt something lift inside me, not guilt, not regret, but a kind of clarity I hadn't known I needed. I was no longer waiting for permission to feel. I was simply feeling. When the session ended, he didn't say a word. He stepped back from the canvas, examining it with a quiet intensity. I didn't ask to see it. I wasn't sure I was ready. Instead, I rose slowly, brushing the fabric of my dress smooth with my palms. He opened the door for me, and I stepped out into the hallway without looking back. That afternoon, I wandered into town again. I needed time to think, space to breathe. I visited the flower shop, then walked aimlessly through streets I had walked for years but rarely noticed. Everything looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. I was noticing details I'd once overlooked, the way the sunlight reflected off the bakery window, the uneven rhythm of footsteps on the pavement, the muted laughter coming from a cafe terrace. When I returned home, my husband was already there. He was standing in the kitchen, sorting through mail, his expression unreadable. He glanced up briefly and asked if I'd remembered to buy printer ink. I nodded, placing the small box on the counter. He thanked me without looking up again. Dinner was uneventful. We talked about the weather, the possibility of an upcoming business trip, whether the neighbor's tree was leaning too far over our fence. I responded as I always had, with attentiveness, with the right tone, with practiced ease. But I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing into the space between us. After dinner, he returned to his office. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes slowly, watching the steam rise from the sink. My hands moved automatically, but my mind stayed in the studio, tracing the memory of his brush moving across canvas, of the moment when silence had said more than words ever could. Later, I opened my notebook again. I wrote. Some changes happen without announcement. They unfold quietly, like a shadow shifting with the sun. I closed the notebook and placed it on the nightstand. In bed, I lay still, listening once again to my husband's breathing beside me. I wasn't angry with him. I wasn't even distant. I was just somewhere else. A little further from him than I had been before, and a little closer to something I hadn't yet named. The next morning, he mentioned his business trip again. Said he might be gone a couple of nights. I nodded, offered the usual reassurances. We didn't discuss the details. We didn't need to. We had become very good at moving through life in parallel, close enough to function, far enough to not collide. That night, after he had gone to bed, I stood outside the studio once more. The door was closed, the light off. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. Whatever needed to happen next would happen on its own time. But in that moment, standing in the dark hallway with my hand resting on the doorframe, I understood something simple and profound. The most dangerous kind of distance is the one that forms inside your own skin, the distance between who you've become and who you thought you'd always be. And I was no longer afraid of crossing it. The morning my husband left for his business trip, I stood in the doorway and watched him roll his suitcase down the front steps. His jacket was pressed, his shoes polished, his phone already in his hand before the car had even arrived. He waved once, casually, without looking up. I waved back and held my posture until the car disappeared around the corner. Then I stood there for a moment longer, unmoving, as if something in the air needed to settle. The house was quiet in his absence, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that breathes differently. Everything felt slower, softer, lighter in a way I hadn't expected. I moved through the rooms without urgency. I opened the windows, let the light in, aired out the corners that always felt a little stale. Even the furniture seemed to relax its grip on stillness. By mid-morning, I had cleaned the kitchen, folded the laundry, and stood barefoot in the hallway, unsure of what to do with myself. My hand hovered over the notebook on the console table, the one with the scattered thoughts and half-sentences. I opened it, flipped past the pages I had already filled, and wrote one sentence in the center of a blank one: I no longer feel afraid of choosing. I didn't need to specify what I was choosing. Around noon, I walked up the stairs toward the studio. The door was already open. I could hear the faint sound of classical music, something string-heavy, slow and layered. He was there, standing by the window with a brush in his hand, gazing out at nothing in particular. He turned when he heard me approach but didn't speak. There was no need to. We were well past that now. He gestured toward the stool, and I stepped into place without hesitation. My movements were steady, deliberate. There was no uncertainty in my posture anymore. I sat, let the light fall across my collarbone and arms, let the stillness between us fill the room without the weight of tension. It felt less like posing and more like arriving. He painted quietly. Occasionally he would pause, lean back, squint slightly, then continue. I watched his face more than I watched his hand. There was focus there, yes, but also something gentler. It wasn't about capturing me perfectly. It was about understanding something wordless. As the afternoon wore on, the sun shifted, and with it, the mood in the room. We were still silent, but the silence had changed. It felt more intimate now, like a room with shared breath. When he set the brush down and stepped away from the canvas, I remained seated. Neither of us moved quickly. The world outside the studio could have stopped, and I wouldn't have noticed. He walked toward me slowly and sat on the edge of the low bench by the window. His eyes met mine, and in that stillness, something passed between us, something that didn't ask to be named or explained. We spent the night together. What that meant didn't unfold in grand gestures or declarations. It lived in the quiet rituals of being near someone. The shared space. The closeness. The way small movements became meaningful without being spoken aloud. The hours stretched, not in rush or confusion, but in the kind of slowness that feels sacred. When morning came, light filtered through the curtains like a soft reminder. I woke early, not out of habit, but out of awareness. The studio was still quiet. The world hadn't changed outside those walls, but something in me had shifted again, something deeper, more permanent. I left the studio quietly, pausing just outside the door to steady my breath. My feet moved down the hall slowly, my hands trailing along the edge of the wall, fingertips brushing over familiar textures that somehow felt new. Downstairs, the house greeted me like an old friend. The kettle still hissed. The table still stood in its place. But everything carried a different energy now, not because the space had changed, but because I had. I made tea, holding the cup close to my chest as I stood in the center of the kitchen. I didn't try to make sense of what had happened. There was no logic to chase, no confession to rehearse. What had unfolded the night before wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a plan. It was an answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. Later, I sat at the table with my notebook again. I didn't write anything for a while. I just sat there, letting the steam from the tea curl around my face. Eventually, I picked up the pencil and scribbled a line along the top of the page. There is a kind of truth that lives only in the spaces we are taught to fear. I set the notebook down without closing it. I left the kitchen, walked into the living room, and opened the windows again. The breeze was soft, and the sky was pale blue, streaked with clouds. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a dog barking. Someone's wind chimes danced lightly with the wind. I stood there for a long time, letting it all in. The light. The air. The weight and the weightlessness of what had happened. Later that afternoon, I passed by the studio again. The door was closed now. There was no music. No sound. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. I had learned, over these past weeks, that not all closeness required repetition. Some moments were meant to be held, not chased. When evening came, I made a simple dinner: roasted vegetables, warm bread, olive oil with herbs. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. No television. No phone. Just the sound of the knife against the plate and the occasional creak of the wood beneath my chair. My husband was due home the next day. That thought didn't bring dread. It didn't bring guilt either. It just was. A fact among other facts. I didn't know what I would say. I didn't even know if I would say anything. But I did know that I couldn't return to pretending that nothing inside me had changed. That night, I walked through the house before bed, turning off lights, closing windows. I moved with care, not out of ritual, but out of presence. Every switch, every step, every breath, I felt all of it. In the hallway upstairs, I paused before our bedroom door, my hand resting on the knob. Then I let it go and continued to the guest room. I changed into clean clothes, brushed my hair, and climbed into bed alone. The sheets were cool against my skin. I closed my eyes and listened to the house breathe. And in that stillness, I didn't feel lost. I felt certain. The following morning arrived without ceremony. I woke before the sun had fully climbed over the rooftops, my body already alert though the house was still wrapped in the calm hush of early hours. The guest room felt colder than I had anticipated, as if unfamiliar bedsheets had not yet learned the warmth of my skin. I sat up slowly, waiting for the quiet to settle into my bones before standing. Downstairs, everything remained in its place, obedient and unchanged. I moved with slow, purposeful gestures, boiling water for tea, slicing fruit, toasting bread. I wasn't hungry, not in a physical sense, but the rituals helped. They reminded me I still had form and function, even when my thoughts felt too vast to contain. There was no note from him. No message, no brush left drying beside the sink, no folded sketch page tucked beneath my door. I didn't expect one. What happened between us had not been about beginnings or endings. It was a moment lived completely, fully, and perhaps, quietly, finished. The silence in the studio confirmed it. I passed by the door as I carried folded linens upstairs and paused briefly, hand grazing the wood. No music. No creak of the floor. No scent of paint drifting through the gap beneath the door. I didn't linger. I continued up the stairs and placed the linens in the hall cupboard like I had done 100 times before. But everything felt different now. Not fractured, not broken, just rearranged. Like furniture shifted slightly after a storm, nothing ruined, but nothing in quite the same place. By noon, my husband was due home. I found myself glancing at the clock more often than necessary, even though I had no intention of preparing anything special. Still, there was a sense of anticipation I couldn't ignore, not excitement, not dread, just a quiet wondering about how it would feel to see him again, to step back into our shared roles after stepping so far away from myself. I stood at the mirror in the upstairs bathroom, brushing my hair with slow strokes. I studied my reflection without judgment. I looked older, perhaps, or maybe simply more awake. There was a softness in my features I hadn't seen before, an absence of tension in my brow, a looseness in my shoulders. I didn't try to correct it. I didn't try to make myself look like the version of me he'd expect to see. The sound of the front door opening came mid-afternoon. It was unmistakable, the weight of his suitcase thudding against the floor, the soft jingle of keys, the way he called out my name not with concern but routine. I took a breath and stepped out of the bedroom, making my way downstairs as though the day was just another in a long line of uneventful ones. He was standing in the foyer, one hand on the strap of his bag, the other holding his phone. He looked up as I descended and smiled, a simple greeting that barely touched the corners of his mouth. "Trip was fine," he said, before I could ask. I nodded. "Good." He walked past me into the kitchen, beginning to unpack snacks and receipts and a crumpled boarding pass. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the ease with which he slipped back into the house, the way his body fit the rooms like a puzzle piece I had once carefully carved around. There was comfort in it. Familiarity. But also a kind of distance, the same kind I had felt weeks ago before everything began to shift. We talked that evening over dinner, the conversation practical. He asked about the garden, whether I'd remembered to reschedule the dental appointment, if the neighbor had mentioned anything about the tree. I answered everything truthfully. There was no reason not to. He didn't ask about the studio. He didn't ask if anything had changed. And I didn't offer. That night, he went to bed early, tired from travel. I stayed downstairs, reading a book I couldn't follow, my thoughts drifting too often to the stillness of the house. When I finally joined him, I lay on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling in the dark. He was already asleep, his breathing steady and deep. I wondered how much a person could change without being noticed by the one closest to them. Over the next few days, we settled back into routine. Mornings with coffee and emails, afternoons of errands and quiet work, evenings with television and low conversation. It was all so familiar, yet none of it quite reached me anymore. I moved through it like a person walking a familiar path after an earthquake, aware of every small crack, every subtle shift beneath the surface. And yet, there was no confrontation. No accusations. No discovery. Just a calm continuation, as if nothing had ever threatened the structure we'd built. But I had changed. I felt it every time I passed the studio door, which remained closed now. I felt it in my shoulders when I stood in the garden, in my fingers when I picked up a book, in my breath as I drifted off to sleep. I had stepped out of a version of myself I had worn for too long, and now I couldn't slip back in without noticing where it pinched. One afternoon, I found myself drawn back to my notebook. I flipped through the pages, each one bearing sentences that traced the shape of my inner landscape. On a fresh sheet, I wrote. He came home, and the walls welcomed him. But I was no longer the wallpaper. I closed the book slowly, pressing my palm to its cover as if it might carry warmth. Later that week, as I folded laundry in the guest room, my husband entered quietly and leaned against the doorway. "You've seemed different lately," he said. I paused, my hands stilling on the fabric. "In a good way?" I asked, not looking up. He shrugged. "Just different. Quieter, maybe. More thoughtful." I nodded, folding the last shirt with care. "I've had more time to think." He didn't press further. He offered a half-smile and left the room. I stood alone, the silence filling in behind him like water. That evening, we sat together in the living room, the television murmuring in the background. He sipped his drink. I read. Our lives ran parallel again, no longer crossing but not entirely apart. I felt a kind of peace in it. Not resolution. Not healing. Just presence. And sometimes, presence was enough. The invitation arrived without ceremony. A folded piece of paper slipped beneath the door of my bedroom, resting silently on the wood like a message carried in by the wind. I recognized the handwriting before I touched it, neat, measured, the strokes of someone who chose each word with care. I stood for a moment, holding it in my palm, debating whether to open it at all. But curiosity, as always, has its own gravity. I unfolded the paper slowly, smoothing the crease with my fingertips. The note was brief: the gallery opening is tomorrow evening. I'd like you to come. No expectations. Just presence. No name. None needed. I stared at the words for a long time. There was no part of me that didn't understand what this was: a threshold, an offering, a possibility. But it wasn't an invitation to return to something. It was a gesture toward something else entirely. Something forward. The rest of the day moved around me like a river, but I stayed mostly still. I didn't mention the note to my husband. I didn't make excuses or ask permission. I simply placed the paper into the drawer of my nightstand, closed it gently, and went about my routines. I cleaned the bathroom. I watered the plants. I washed and folded towels I had no real need to wash. That evening, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. Choosing a dress had become such a casual task over the years, often dictated by weather, errands, or lack of interest. But tonight, I chose with intention. I selected a navy blue dress that fit me well without asking for attention. Something soft, with a quiet silhouette. I pinned my hair back at the sides and added a touch of lipstick, not bold, but enough to remind myself I was still capable of accent. When I stepped into the gallery the next night, the space greeted me with familiar light and unfamiliar noise. People filled the open room, their voices low but layered. The walls were lined with canvases, each illuminated by its own narrow spotlight, casting delicate shadows on the polished floors. The scent of wine and varnish lingered in the air. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting my gaze drift from one piece to the next. His style was unmistakable, gentle yet precise, always aware of weight and balance. The paintings weren't portraits in the literal sense. They were fragments of people. Glimpses. A shoulder here. The curve of a wrist. A glance caught mid-turn. Each image felt suspended in a moment just before movement. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, in the center of a soft, spotlighted alcove, stood a canvas slightly taller than the rest. It was a woman, not me, not exactly. The likeness wasn't in the lines of my face, but in the posture, the stillness, the way the shadows fell across her chest and throat. She stood turned slightly away, looking at something beyond the frame. Her expression was unreadable. Not distant. Not inviting. Just present. The title plaque read only, Stillness. I stood before it longer than I had meant to. People passed behind me, voices rising and falling like tidewater, but I didn't move. I felt no urge to. The painting held something of me, yes, but it also held something of the journey. A quiet knowing. An acceptance of all the things that had passed between silence and speech. After a time, I became aware of someone standing just behind my right shoulder. Not close enough to intrude. Just there. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. I didn't turn. I wasn't sure either. His silence felt like a pause rather than a reply. Then he stepped beside me, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. "I painted this the morning after," he said. "I know," I replied. We stood together, not speaking, watching the version of me he had captured. I didn't ask what he saw. I didn't need to. Whatever lived in that canvas was already understood. Eventually, he nodded toward the far side of the gallery. "There's more," he said, "but this one was never meant for sale." I nodded once, then turned and walked away, not from him, but into the rest of the gallery. I passed others, a couple whispering, a man taking notes, a young girl staring up at one of the pieces as if trying to memorize it. Each person seemed wrapped in their own experience, their own interpretation of what they saw. Later, near the end of the evening, I found a quiet bench near the back wall and sat. I removed the notebook from my purse, small, worn, familiar. I flipped past the filled pages, found an empty one, and began to write. Art doesn't save us. But sometimes, it holds the part of us that needed to be seen. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back in my bag. As I stood to leave, he appeared again, not blocking my path, not asking anything. Just standing there. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For allowing me to see you." I nodded, offering a faint smile. "It was never about being seen," I said. "It was about remembering I was still here." Then I turned and walked out into the evening air. The city felt different at night, softer, more forgiving. The streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, and the pavement glowed slightly from a recent rain. I walked without hurrying, without a destination beyond home. When I reached the front steps of my house, I stood for a moment with my hand on the railing. Inside, everything would look the same. The lamp in the hallway. The book left open on the table. My husband sitting in his usual chair, maybe sipping tea, maybe half asleep. But I wasn't walking back into the same life. I was walking into a version of it where I existed fully, where I no longer waited to be noticed, or asked for permission to feel. A life where I could sit in stillness and know that it belonged to me, not because someone else gave it meaning, but because I had finally chosen to occupy it completely. I opened the door and stepped inside. The house greeted me with its usual hush. The kind of quiet that only comes when everything is exactly where it should be, but nothing feels quite the same. I closed the door behind me gently, letting the lock click into place with a soft finality. The hallway stretched ahead of me, unchanged in its proportions, familiar in its dim glow. Yet as I stepped inside, I could feel the weight of the gallery still clinging to my shoulders, not heavy, but present, like a whisper that had followed me home. He was in the living room. I could see the faint outline of his shape in the soft lamplight, seated in the armchair near the window. He didn't call out. He didn't ask where I had been. I paused in the hallway, unsure whether to speak or simply continue on. But before I could decide, he turned slightly and looked toward me. "Did you have a good evening?" he asked. His tone wasn't sharp or suspicious. It was calm. Almost too calm. The kind of calm that made me wonder what he knew, or perhaps what he'd chosen not to say. I nodded. "Yes," I replied, stepping out of my shoes. There was an exhibit downtown. I wanted to see it. He gave a small nod in return and turned back toward the window. The quiet settled again. I moved through the house with practiced ease, placing my bag on the kitchen counter, filling a glass with water. I drank slowly, letting the coolness of it ground me. Everything around me felt still, but beneath the surface, something had changed. Not an eruption. Not a collapse. More like a soft shifting of plates deep below the earth, something imperceptible but permanent. Later, when I went upstairs, I walked into our bedroom without pausing. The bed had already been turned down. My side remained untouched. He would join me soon, slip under the covers with the same careful movements he always used. But tonight, I wasn't thinking about routine. I was thinking about how the gallery had smelled, about the hum of voices, about the way people looked at the painting titled Stillness and tilted their heads slightly as if searching for meaning. And I was thinking about how I had stood among them, not as a subject or a muse, but as a woman who had walked through fire without burning. A woman who had stood in her own silence and learned how to breathe there. I didn't sleep easily that night, but I didn't toss or turn. I simply lay awake, eyes open in the dark, listening to the soft movements of the house. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel triumph. I felt present. In the morning, he didn't ask again where I had been. He poured his coffee, read the paper, made passing comments about the weather. I listened, answered when necessary, and kept my own thoughts tucked neatly behind my smile. It wasn't deceit. It was self-preservation. Not everything needed to be spoken to be understood. As the days passed, I began to notice small things. He lingered in rooms longer than before. He watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. His silences stretched just a bit more than they used to. There was no accusation in his eyes, but there was awareness. Whether it came from instinct or evidence, I didn't know. And I wasn't sure I needed to. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky turn from blue to gray, he cleared his throat softly. "You seem different," he said. I kept my eyes on the horizon. "I suppose I am." He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how. He just nodded and continued sipping his tea. That was our language, few words, open spaces. And in that silence, we both knew things had shifted. I found myself in the studio again one morning, long after he had left for work. The space hadn't changed. The canvases were still lined against the wall, the scent of oil paint still faint in the air. The stool sat under the window, catching light that poured through in long golden streaks. I didn't sit this time. I simply walked around the room slowly, touching nothing but noticing everything. His brushes, left where he had last used them. The sketchbook, closed and resting on the corner table. The place had become sacred, not because of what happened inside it, but because of what it represented, a return to self, a reckoning, a revival. As I stood in the center of the room, I realized I no longer felt the weight of needing to be seen. That was the irony. The search for visibility had led me to a place where I finally felt whole, and now, I didn't need the mirror anymore. I left the studio without a word and returned to the kitchen. I brewed a pot of tea, opened the windows, and sat at the table with my notebook. I flipped past the pages, filled with confessions, questions, fragments of truth, and found the final blank one. I wrote, "Wholeness isn't found in being chosen. It's found in choosing yourself, again and again, even when the world is watching." I didn't close the notebook this time. I left it open on the table, the words still fresh, still soft in their finality. In the days that followed, I moved through life differently. Not as someone carrying a secret, but as someone who had outgrown the space she once occupied. I cooked meals. I returned phone calls. I tended the garden. But everything I did now came from a place of ownership. The version of myself that had lived quietly beneath years of compromise had stepped forward, and she wasn't leaving. One Sunday morning, we hosted neighbors for brunch. The air was full of small talk and clinking glasses, laughter that didn't touch the bone. I moved among the guests gracefully, answering questions, refilling drinks, smiling with ease. And I noticed him watching me, my husband, from across the patio, a subtle furrow in his brow. When the guests had gone and the dishes were done, he came to stand beside me in the kitchen. "You've changed," he said again, softer this time. "I had to," I replied, without turning. He stood there for a long moment. I could feel his thoughts pressing against the silence, searching for a place to rest. But none came. Eventually, he nodded, barely. "Okay," he said. And that was enough. Not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged everything. That night, I sat by the window long after the lights were out. I thought about the canvas in the gallery, about the way people had stared at it as though it held something sacred. I thought about how they hadn't known my name, hadn't known the story, hadn't needed to. And I thought about the stillness, not the one on the canvas, but the one inside me. It was no longer something I feared. It was where I had learned to exist. And where, Finally, I had learned to begin.